Good morning, everybody. This is our first attempt at a pre-recorded session that we are doing at least for the next couple weeks while we are stuck at home as far as teachers go. And hopefully I'm doing this late enough to where nobody will interrupt. So we're going to jump right into it, get going, and we will see how this works tomorrow morning. So we are going to be doing something that if I had my preference, we would be doing this type of stuff or this lesson, this one lesson in particular, um, on campus. But we are not able to do that, so we're gonna probably have to make some adjustments here and there. So let's go ahead. We'll jump right into this and get going. Okay. So we are looking at chain of custody and standard operating procedures. So our goals this week are to model procedures to ensure chain of custody when collecting evidence and then employ good practices of confidentiality. So as we go through this, we'll be talking a lot about um, evidence and how to properly seal it, how to properly package it. But it's such a wide um, area, right? It depends on what how you're going to package something depends on what it is you're packaging. And some of it's even counterintuitive, as I will point out. But it's such a wide area that I'm going to be referring to something called standard operating procedures consistently as we go through this. What I'm compiling right now, or for the most part have compiled already, is a standard operating procedure that we will use for all different types of evidence. So if you're ever in the field or we are doing a crime scene and you need to know, hey, how am I supposed to collect this particular evidence? You'll be able to refer to these standard operating procedures. They usually call them SOPs. And we'll talk about that as we go through here. All right. All right. So the assignment this week is going to be a little bit different. I was planning on doing some demo, and we may have to do some pre-recorded demo videos again. Um, and in addition to that, I'll be posting a link to the SOPs as well as access to the forms, the standard forms that we will be required to use as well. So the assignment this week will basically be practice in chain of custody and how to properly fill out like an evidence envelope, and it will include maybe properly sealing the envelope as well. Um, but because we're still working distance education, we might have to get a little creative with this. So we will discuss and actually work on this assignment together on either Thursday or Friday, whenever our next live session is, depending on which day we meet for this particular class. Okay. All right, so let's go ahead and get going on the actual notes. So what is chain of custody? When we're talking about chain of custody, we're basically referring to the documentation of who had possession of the evidence from the time it was collected to the time of analysis and beyond. And when we're discussing chain of custody, right, the procedures for that, inevitably we're going to also discuss evidence preservation and evidence packaging and sealing, and we're going to talk about all the different things that go hand in hand with chain of custody. So why is chain of custody so important? Again, it's about making sure your evidence is admissible in court. We need to maintain the integrity of the evidence. This means that we can demonstrate to the court that the evidence collected was the actual evidence tested and reported on. It shows that there was no change, no contamination, no replacement, etc., that occurred anytime since it was collected to when it was analyzed. It establishes a continuity of possession. Every single person who has handled or examined the evidence must be accounted for. It starts from the crime scene. It's basically critical to mark the evidence, package it correctly, um, mark packages, ensure proper seals, record the chain of possession, preserve the evidence every step of the way. It has to be maintained. One mistake in paperwork, and you could basically have a very important piece of evidence just thrown out and inadmissible. So it's important to do that. And this is something that'll be maintained through each of the courses, Forensics 1, Forensics 2 when we're in the lab, as well as Forensics 3. All right, so what are the key components of an evidence control system? Because that's what we're basically setting up. First, you have to have chain of custody. The minimum things that you need to record on chain of custody are the signature of the person receiving the evidence, the date that the person received it, or it was transferred to, and then the description of the evidence as well. Proper markings of evidence should be included. Evidence seals should be intact and secure. And then you have to also establish a secure area for evidence storage, and that'll be kind of in my department. So when we get, especially when we get to next year, when we have a Forensics 2 class and we've got Forensics 1 and Forensics 2 kind of working together, we will have a particular section of the classroom that's established as an evidence vault. So a quick note, some additional information along with chain of custody may be needed for reference samples. So if we're getting a biological sample from a person, you're going to need the signature of the subject. It could be a suspect. It could be a victim in some cases. But you'll need their signature. You'll need some kind of formal identification papers of the subject. Sometimes you include a thumbprint of the donor, and then the name and signature of the witnesses. And this is usually the individual that's actually collecting the sample, whether it's a blood sample or what. All right, so let's move on to standard operating procedures. Since I'm talking about that a lot, and we're going to be referring to it a lot, let's kind of go over what those are. Standard operating procedures, or SOP, are written procedures or instructions on how to perform a task. There are standard operating procedures in the lab for certain pieces of lab equipment, for example, as well as standard operating procedures for crime scene investigators in the field, how to properly collect certain pieces of evidence. So again, one of the things we're going to be doing throughout the rest of the year, especially next semester, is looking at specific items. We'll focus on, for example, hey, what's the proper procedures when we come into contact with a fingerprint? How do you actually properly collect the fingerprint when you're dusting for fingerprints, for example, or a weapon, or controlled substances, or what's the proper way of dealing with biological samples and things like that. So we can't do it in this set of notes because it would just be way too wide, which is why we're taking all of next semester and kind of breaking it up into pieces and discussing them one at a time. So the procedures for collection, handling, packaging, and preserving evidence are going to be written out for you. It will include all the chain of custody procedures, the documentation of the evidence collected at the scene, transportation to the laboratory or within the laboratory or out of the laboratory. It also includes usually the security of the evidence at all times. A lot of times for real labs, it's going to have required trainings before you're allowed to handle that evidence. The roles and responsibility of laboratory personnel as well as crime scene investigative personnel, and then any audits or accreditations that have to occur for the lab. So standard operating procedures are pretty wide. We're keeping it a little bit simplified. Obviously, we can't do everything that a real crime lab could do, although a lot of the things kind of, we don't have the $200,000 gas chromatography machines that they have. So some of those things, we won't have to worry about the standard operating procedures for like a complicated piece of machinery like that. So we're keeping it a little bit simplified. So we'll focus on standard operating procedures for this class for crime scene investigation. And then when you get into Forensics 2, the standard operating procedures will be based on the equipment we have available to test the different pieces of evidence. All right. So what's the purpose of proper evidence collection? Why do we have to be careful on how we collect it? And that's where the standard operating procedures are going to come in handy, okay? One of the main goals in properly collecting evidence is basically to ensure the integrity of the evidence by not damaging, destroying, or contaminating the evidence during the procedure. So you don't want to take a small, fragile piece of evidence and pick it up and somehow damage it or break it or scratch it or contaminate it in any way, because then you're going to ruin the evidence. It's not going to be as valuable to us as investigators. Proper evidence collection techniques will be determined by the type of evidence and the environment that the evidence is found. So that's why we're not going to spend a whole lot of time on this, because it would literally take several days worth of notes to get through every single type of evidence. That's where the standard operating procedure manual that we're putting together will come in handy. So it'll be something that you can refer to. And again, with practice and time, you'll get used to different types of evidence, and you'll probably become, a little bit of an expert at collecting or how to collect or how to package certain types of evidence. All right. So what's the main purpose of proper evidence packaging? Now we're switching to packaging, right? So again, this could vary from evidence to evidence, depending on what it is we're trying to package. There's lots of different things, everything from guns to little pieces of trace evidence. So the main objective when we're packaging the evidence is to prevent any change in the evidence between the time it's removed from the crime scene and the time it's received by the laboratory. All evidence should be packaged separately from each other. This prevents cross-contamination. So even if you have shell casings and you're sure they're from the same gun, you would not pick up each shell casing and put them in the same package, because they would bang or scratch each other and cause additional striations or markings on the casings themselves. So you would actually individually wrap each casing, okay? And that helps prevent cross-contamination or any damage that can occur. How each item of evidence should be packaged, again, depends on the type of evidence and the conditions we're in. Some things may seem counterintuitive. For example, a lot of people that aren't experienced with this, if they have a blood-soaked shirt that's still wet, a lot of times they'll collect it and the assumption is, hey, I better put this in a plastic bag so it doesn't leak all over. And actually, that could damage the biological evidence. It could actually cause the degradation of the DNA that we might be able to get from that item. So certain things probably should be packaged in paper, and then a lot of times when it's packaged in paper, it's sent to the lab, and the lab immediately pulls it out and actually dries it before they repackage that shirt as a dried blood sample. But again, all these procedures would be outlined in the standard operating procedure manual, and it'll help you out. So if you come across something and you're like, I don't remember how to package this, you'll be able to refer to the manual that we're going to supply you with. Likewise, when sealing evidence, so now we're up to where we're sealing it. When we're sealing the evidence, we want to ensure evidence integrity by avoiding contamination and ensure that the evidence can't be tampered with in any way. All seals must be properly done, and there should be a signature as well as a date on the seal. And we're going to talk about that. I'm going to give you some examples too as we go through this. When a seal is broken to get to the evidence, for example, if it gets to the lab and they want to pull the evidence out so they can run a test on a particular piece of evidence, they have to break that seal. But it should be done in such a way that the original seal is still visible and readable, and it also should be resealed in the proper way, keeping the original packaging with it. We want to be able to see those seals. Again, it's kind of part of maintaining that chain of custody, right? So again, standard operating procedures should be maintained and followed, and it'll be outlined in that manual. All right, so how do we determine the packaging? Paper, plastic, box, bag, envelope, what are we putting in? So the standard operating procedure manual will help you with this as well. And with experience, you'll get better at this, and that always helps, right? In general, however, plastic is good for things like drugs or things of that type that we don't want, to be exposed to. Paper is better for things like biological samples because, again, if we put it in plastic and seal it, it traps in the moisture and it basically causes the degradation of the DNA. The size of the package should be considered. If we have something really large and bulky, it would do us absolutely no good putting it in a little rinky-dink envelope like this. So we got to consider that. Too small a package will fail over time. The seal will fail especially. Too big, and the evidence can be dispersed throughout the container or even lost. In those cases, you might want to use like a chemist fold or something called a bindle, which is basically a folded up piece of paper to put the trace evidence in before you put it into a larger envelope. Sometimes evidence is going to require those extra internal packagings, like the bindle I just mentioned, or a box, or maybe a coin envelope, or some kind of sharps container for maybe a syringe that was found or something that's could poke you. So here's a couple of examples of how not to package evidence. Here's the example that I was mentioning, where if you have an envelope that's too small and you're trying to stuff something in there, that's not going to do us any good. You can see that it doesn't even really hold the envelope shut. Um, the opposite is true. If we have a small fragment, it's hard to see, but there's a little tiny piece of glass right there. And if we don't properly seal the envelope, we can lose some of this trace evidence as well. So you might want to take something like that and put it into a bindle before you put it into a larger envelope where it can possibly come out of a not quite sealed envelope or an opening in the envelope or tear through the envelope. So how do we seal the evidence? Sealing evidence properly is a requirement of all crime labs. We'll be using evidence tape as seals. Okay. They also have heat seals and lock seals, but the one we will be using is typical evidence tape, and we'll be sealing our evidence with that. All seals must be initialed to document the person sealing the evidence and date it to indicate when the evidence was sealed. And I'm going to give you some examples of this as well. So here's a couple of how not to seal evidence, right? So if you take a look, the seal should completely seal the envelope flap. So if you take and put it on here, even if you put two of them on there, that's not good enough. The evidence seal should actually be going along the edge and even wrapping around the back of the envelope. Okay, and I'm going to show you a good one in a couple of slides. So that's true of envelopes. It's also true of bags, right? The seal should be completely sealed. So again, in this one, we would have the seal going all the way along and even wrapping around part of the back. So that's important. We have to have that seal maintained. We don't want to have any openings or ways that evidence could either spill out accidentally or get contaminated in some way. Staples are not appropriate evidence seal for the same reasons that we want to seal all the way along there, right? So even if you put, 100 staples in there, that's not going to be sufficient. So this is a couple of properly or correctly sealed pieces of evidence. So the tape seals across the entire flap. So on this bag, it's going all the way across the seal. Same thing on the envelope, all the way across the seal, right? It's completely sealed, and it's wrapping around the back side, okay? The seal must be initialed and dated with part of the writing on the envelope and part of the writing on the seal. So if you take a look, it looks like they have a date here and then the initials MM, or here it's JD with a date. And those dates and initials are important because if this seal gets broken, either inadvertently or intentionally, and somebody tries to reseal it, if it's not perfectly lined up, we can tell, hey, this looks like this seal's been tampered with, and the people in the lab can make a note of that at the very least, or bring it to a supervisor at the worst if they think it's been tampered with. But most of the time, if you actually break this seal to go in, you want to make sure that you break it in a way that the seal, the initials and the date and everything are still readable. So a lot of times what they'll do is if they get this evidence that actually might make the tear in the bottom of the envelope, and then they can reseal it down there if at all possible, or put it into a new package, keeping the original package with it if they have to. The seal should wrap around to the other side. So again, if this were on the other side, it would be taped all the way across the seal, and then it's wrapping around part way around the other side of the envelope or bag. And then usually printed on the envelope or bag, you're going to have a chain of custody form that you have to kind of fill out, right? It's got all the information about the agency, the person collecting it, all the information about the crime scene, maybe a case number, et cetera, description of the evidence. And then this is the actual chain of custody right here, where the person that's filling this out puts their name, where it's going to, and the date, okay? And then when it gets to that location, the person receiving it will put their name and the date, and we just kind of keep going along this chain of custody form. And usually these, again, are on the envelope or bag. I ordered our evidence bags and envelopes with them already on there. They kind of look like this. This is the ones that we are using, okay? This is the bag. It has the chain of custody at the bottom, and then the envelopes are very similar with the chain of custody. I know it's hard to see with some of these, but that's the kind that we ordered. You also might have some that actually are plain, and then you can put a sticker on there that's basically a sticker with the chain of custody on it as well. Either one would be sufficient, but make sure you fill it out completely. So what are some other containers you might come across? There's obviously that's not the only thing we could have, right, is envelopes and bags. And they have plastic bags as well. I didn't put any on there. I should have brought some of those home so I could have showed you. But I forgot about those. But other containers, we could have boxes for weapons, for example. So you got a box for like a handgun. You have longer boxes for rifles and shotguns. They have boxes for knives. So they typically put a lot of these sharp objects or dangerous objects like guns or three-dimensional objects like guns into boxes and seal those. You could have sharp containers. I don't know if you can see that. It's hard to see, but there's actually a pair of scissors in this sharps container. You can have sharps container for syringes, different sizes, etc. Um, you could have packaging glass, like panes of glass in certain ways, usually between a couple pieces of cardboard, and they seal it that way. Liquids would obviously be in something that can hold liquids, right? And then biological swabs. So over here is like a biological swab. So if you're doing a swab of blood or something like that, you would put it in something called a swab box. Again, box and paper seems to be better for biological substances, which is why they use a box instead of like a plastic container or something like that. So you have all these other containers that you can deal with as well. So the last little bit, for our purposes, we will try to always use envelopes and bags that have the chain of custody printed on the package, right? Similar to this, but they can look a little bit different. But for the most part, they have the same basic pieces of it. Usually you have some kind of case number or inventory number up here, and then an item description, the date of recovery, where it was recovered from, all the information that we have there, and then the important part, the chain of custody. So who received it, who they who they uh, who they got it from, the date, and the time. And you have to kind of maintain that through. And then when it gets turned into the lab, they kind of fill it out, with the next person in line, and then the next person in line for the lab tech that's testing it, and so on and so on. So we will be doing some practice with this later this week, as I said, on Thursday. All the parts must be completely filled out. We will also talk a little bit about how to properly seal the envelopes and things like that. But that should be it for us today. We'll see how this works tomorrow. I'm interested to see how this works. Remember, when we're doing this, and I'll remind you at the beginning of class, if you have questions or something, you can type it into the live chat. That's how I'll be kind of communicating tomorrow. All right, guys, have a great day.